Hello everyone, I am Taureor and today we're going to talk about the Mr. Handy robot. But first, a little introduction. I've been making YouTube videos for almost 2 years now, and I also have a master's degree in power engineering, which hopefully will be useful in unraveling the mysteries of video game science. Mr. Handy, a floating robot born of a cooperation between Robeco and General Atomics, he can brew coffee, change a baby, or fry your enemies with a flamethrower. But did you know it will also bankrupt you and burn your entire family alive? To explain how and why, we'll have to get into the construction of the robot itself. It is composed of a central sphere housing all the critical components, 3 eye stalks, 3 multifunctional arms, and a jet engine assembly that keeps it afloat. And all that bad stuff I mentioned before is because of that jet engine. If only they had used propellers. In order to illustrate my point, we'll have to do a little bit of math. Actually, quite a large bit of math. We have to start with the mass of a Mr. Handy unit. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any direct data, so we'll have to do some estimates. This early part of the video will contain quite a bit of estimated values. However, when we get to the cold hard math later on, you'll see that estimating them differently wouldn't really make much of a difference. So we don't know how much a Mr. Handy weighs. However, we do know how large it is. I used the dimensions determined by the guys at Falkenstall Armory that made a pretty cool life-size Mr. Handy replica. And according to their measurements, the central sphere of a Mr. Handy is 40 centimeters in diameter. We can use that to estimate how heavy it is. A 40 centimeter diameter means a 0.2 meter radius, which applied to the formula for the volume of a sphere gives us the result of 0.0335 cubic meters. Now, let's suppose the central sphere is a solid block of stainless steel. Stainless steel has a density of 7,860 kilograms per cubic meter. That will make our Mr. Handy weigh 263.4 kilograms. When we add the arms, the eyes, and the jet assembly, we'll probably get to around 300 kilograms. Now, this is all supposing that Mr. Handy is composed of solid stainless steel, which it isn't. The robot obviously has outer metal plating. However, lighter materials, lighter metals and alloys could be used, as well as ceramic components. Also, as we know from the art book, it has some empty space inside. If we factor in all the lighter materials, empty space inside, and the super advanced technology of the future, I feel it's safe to assume that Mr. Handy will weigh around 30 kilograms instead of 300. I feel like I'm being very generous to the robot here, but correct me if I'm wrong. We should also take into account that according to the information on the box, Mr. Handy is capable of lifting 40 pounds of weight. That translates to 18 kilograms and a bit. Why is that important? All jet aircrafts, and not only them, have a parameter called the thrust-to-weight ratio. The parameter is pretty self-explanatory, but why is it important? Well, it shows how much thrust a vehicle can deliver, and if the thrust-to-weight ratio is above 1, it means that the vehicle can lift itself vertically from the ground. It can just fly straight up. Regular passenger planes don't have that capability, they don't need it. But for example, an F-16 fighter plane has the thrust-to-weight ratio of almost 1.1, which means it can just fly straight up. A Mr. Handy robot floating in mid-air and also capable of carrying 18 kilograms would need the thrust-to-weight ratio of over 1.6. This is a very high value for something jet-powered and also quite difficult from the design standpoint. As the design aspect of Mr. Handy is only loosely connected to the main topic of the video, we can just attribute this to advanced technology of the future. However, I did still want to mention it. Anyway, that lets us move on to more interesting calculations. Now we'll focus on the jet engine itself. Speaking of thrust, Mr. Handy's engine must continuously generate enough thrust to keep it afloat. And how much is it? Well, at least the same amount that Mr. Handy weighs. A common misconception is that weight is measured in kilograms. This is actually not true. Kilograms are a measure of mass, not weight. Weight is measured in the newtons. The easiest way to explain this is if you go to the moon, you will seem lighter, but your mass will still be the same. What changes is the force you exert on the surface of the moon, and the force the surface of the moon exerts on you in return. This depends on gravitational acceleration. This is just a rough explanation, but I don't want to get too far off topic. I could explain the whole notion of force, but that would take at least a few minutes. Moving on. If we are standing on Earth, our weight is actually our mass multiplied by Earth's gravitational acceleration. A body's gravitational pull depends on its mass. Earth's gravitational acceleration is well known and denoted as small g. It is equal to 9.807 approximately. When we multiply this acceleration by Mr. Handy's mass, we'll get its weight, which is equal to 294 newtons, which we'll have to convert into kilonewtons just for future calculations. Now we'll need some technical data for the jet engine. I have decided to work on a real-life example, the General Electric CF6 engine. It's of course of a different size, and the design itself is pretty old, but it is also a widely used reliable engine with very good efficiency parameters. And there is one particular parameter that we will need. It is the thrust-specific fuel consumption. This value shows how much fuel an engine needs to burn to generate a unit of thrust. For this particular engine in SI units it is 8.7. It means with such an engine we would need to burn 8.7 grams of fuel to generate the thrust of 1 kilonewton over 1 second. We're going to assume that Mr. Handy's jet engine has the same efficiency parameters. It could be a little bit more efficient, but ultimately it wouldn't change much. With these parameters, Mr. Handy would need to burn 2.56 grams of fuel per second. It doesn't seem like much, but it does add up really fast. In a minute it becomes 154 grams. In 6.5 minutes it'll burn a whole kilogram of kerosene. In an hour it'll burn 9. In a day 221. And in a year, over 80 tons of fuel. Just imagine how much that would cost you. There is no indication that a Mr. Handy ever lands or rests or hangs on something. So as the sole survivor spends 210 years in a vault, Codsworth during that time would need to burn 17,000 tons of kerosene to keep itself afloat. Now, where does he get that? By now you can see how owning a Mr. Handy would bankrupt you just because you would have to buy 80 tons of fuel a year. Now let's talk about how Mr. Handy will not only empty your wallet but also burn your house and your whole family. The jet engine poses two risks here: depletion of oxygen in your house and the heat. For these calculations we'll need an indoor space. I have selected the main room of the house belonging to the sole survivor. By my rough estimate, the size of the room is about 6 meters by 7 meters by 2.5 meters. It's rough, but it doesn't matter. That is 105 cubic meters of air. Let's drop the 5 to account for the furniture and all that. We're left with 100 cubic meters of air, as density is 1.2 kilograms per cubic meter, which gives us 120 kilograms of air. Kerosene's stoichiometric air-fuel ratio is 15.6. This means we need 15.6 kilograms of air to burn a kilogram of kerosene, which means Mr. Handy would burn all the oxygen in the room in 50 minutes. This is no big deal if the ventilation in the room is good. But close your windows for the night and you'll suffocate. This is, however, not the biggest threat. We have already established Mr. Handy burns a lot of fuel. Burning fuel generates heat. We can use kerosene's heat value and the robot's fuel consumption to calculate just how much heat. So, with a heat value of 42.8 megajoules per kilogram and a kilogram burned in 390 seconds, Mr. Handy generates almost 110 kilowatts of heat. The standard power of an electric space heater is 1.5 kilowatts. This means having a Mr. Handy in your house generates as much heat as having 73 standard electric heaters operating at full power all the time. Let's go back to our example room. With a standard room temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, the specific heat of air being 1005 joules per kilogram Kelvin and 120 kilograms of air in the room, it would only take the robot 88 seconds to bring all of the air in the room to 100 degrees Celsius, which is the boiling point of water. 3 more minutes and all the wood in the room would start igniting. Of course, there will be heat exchange with other objects, some venting and so on, but you see how that would be a problem, right? I think this is more than enough proof that getting a Mr. Handy would be a terrible decision. But before we end, let me entertain one more idea. What if Mr. Handy didn't burn kerosene, but instead run on nuclear power? Microfusion technology is well established in the Fallout universe, and it could easily provide enough power to keep the robot going. It doesn't even have to be a microfusion cell, it could be a refuelable fusion reactor housed within the robot. But can it make it float? Well, during the Cold War, both the US and the Soviets researched nuclear aircraft propulsion. The projects were ultimately abandoned because long-range ballistic missiles made the technology obsolete. It was just too problematic and expensive. However, working prototypes of nuclear jet engines have been created. In such an engine, a nuclear jet engine, there is no fuel combustion. The heat from a nuclear reaction is used to heat up the air within the engine. The heated compressed air expands and exits, generating thrust. Employing microfusion technology in conjunction with a nuclear jet engine would eliminate virtually all the concerns about Mr. Handy. It would not require this much fuel because of the amazing efficiency of nuclear fusion. It would not burn up the air in the room because there is no combustion, but it would still generate an obscene amount of heat. Enough to boil everyone who's in a room with the robot. Fusion-powered nuclear propulsion is actually a great prospect if we can ever perfect this technology, but not indoors. Another fun fact is that the old Fallout games actually had a much more feasible Mr. Handy. It was kept afloat with 2 shielded propellers. They might not be as cool as a jet, but are also much less deadly. In conclusion, don't get a Mr. Handy, unless it's the propeller model. And better yet, give it wheels. I hope all of you enjoyed this little video. It's the first I've ever made about video game science. If you like it, there might be more, so tell me what you think. And also make sure to check out the lore and theory videos on my channel and subscribe and all that. See ya.